This is my 21st video on my attempts to construct a small 00 gauge layout. See part 1 for my reasons for doing this, and my lengthy series on my N-gauge railway modelling for more interesting stuff with trains actually running, etc. This part will be a fairly brief kit build review of the Airfix Dapol Thatched Cottage kit C020. This is a styrene construction kit that was sold by Airfix back around the 1970s and is still currently available from Depaul. I was building from the current production Depaul version. I definitely have a certain personal nostalgia for Airfix, as the very first kit I ever built on my 8th birthday was from Airfix, and I spent my pocket money on an uncounted number of their kits in my childhood and adolescence. This will be a fairly brief video as compared to some of my other kit builds, as this is a fairly simple kit. Spoiler alert, overall conclusion, simple to build but quite a challenge to paint. Here's what you get with the current Depaul kit, so far as I know pretty much the same as you got with the old Airfix version. 1 sprue of small grey plastic parts and 8 other parts not on sprues, and a sheet of instructions. That's it. No decals, no glazing, no printed paper other than the instructions. There was a certain amount of flash, which, given the likely age of the moulds, is hardly surprising. See at top centre here, for example. The window parts for this kit are a little strange, resulting in something of an issue. The part for each window consists of a rather chunky frame, which is flat with a cast-on sill on one side and recessed to fit into the hole in the wall on the other side. See, for example, the parts at top left, where the recessing is clearly visible. The instructions clearly indicate that the window parts should be glued in place with the sills on the outside, as shown on the wall at bottom left here. On the other hand, it's perfectly possible to glue them in place with the sills on the inside, so getting a simple recessed effect on the outside, as shown on the wall at bottom right here. I looked at many pictures on the internet of cottages assembled from this kit, and they seem to be roughly evenly divided between the two ways of using the window parts, perhaps leaning slightly to the outer recessed method, so the opposite of what the instructions indicate. Looking at the pictures, I felt that assembling the windows as shown in the instructions resulted in a rather crude and clunky-looking effect, and that generally the results of the outer recess type of assembly seemed to look better, so I decided to go with the method as shown at bottom right here. The kit does not provide any glazing for the windows. I cut glazing pieces for all of the windows from some suitable clear acetate that I had on hand. I basically just put the window parts on the acetate and drew round each part with a marker and then cut out accordingly. I didn't glue the glazing in place at this point, as I wanted to spray paint everything, including the window frames. I did glue the window frames in place in the walls, as I decided to have the window frames white, the same as the base colour of the walls. You can see at bottom centre left where I've had to repair one of the window frames with putty, as it had a major casting error resulting in a big gap on one side. I assembled the walls together with their included window frames. I assembled the chimney and taped it in place on the end with masking tape. This was basically just to mask the area under the chimney to make it easier to glue the chimney in place subsequently. I didn't want to glue it in place at this point, as I wanted to be able to separate it to paint and weather it independently from the walls. You can see the putty repaired window frame at back right again. You can also see here how the sills of the windows are on the inside. Next I assembled the roof parts, as I wanted to paint and finish the roof as a whole. The part in my hand here is the ridge for the roof. It had quite a bit of mess from bad casting inside it and needed to be cleaned up with knife and file before it would fit in place. Here the ridge is glued in place, completing the assembly of the roof. So now the cottage is mostly pre-assembled, the walls with the window frames and the chimney temporarily attached, and the roof, with the only remaining parts being the front and back doors seen at left, which I didn't attach as I wanted to paint them separately. Now I spray painted the wall and roof assemblies. The walls were sprayed a basic white, which was the fairly obvious choice. The instructions suggested painting the roof a pale yellow, but it seems in practice that thatch appears basically brownish grey, except just after it's redone, so I went with an overspray of a bronze brown. Next came the really tricky part of this build, painting all of the beams black. I couldn't see any way of making this any easier. It was just necessary to go all around the walls, painting the beams black by hand, one by one. I tried to keep my hand as steady as I could, but this was definitely a challenge, and quite a long-winded and tedious task. Once I'd done my best to paint all the beams and let them dry, I tried the roof in place. And you can see how I've taken the chimney off the end here. Next I turned to finishing the chimney, which being stonework needs to be finished completely differently from the rest of the walls. I painted over the whole chimney with a light grey. Whilst doing this I also painted the doors with a streaky brown effect for wood. Now I turned to glazing the windows, gluing my previously cut pieces of acetate onto the insides of the frames, resting on the sills. It's hard to see, but the acetate is in place on all the windows here, most clearly seen perhaps at top right. Here's a close-up showing the glazing. I did need to scrape the windows a bit to remove paint overspray, then I used polycement to glue on the acetate. I found this works okay for gluing acetate to polystyrene. I painted some details on the doors. I glued coloured paper curtains to all of the windows, simply gluing printed paper strips to the acetate using rocket glue. Here's the outside of the back wall showing the glazing and the curtains, and the rather shaky job I made of painting the beams. I weathered the chimney after the base grey dried with black and brown washes. Once dry, the chimney was glued in place on the end wall. The roof could then be glued in place, fitting as well as possible round the chimney, and the doors were also glued in place. The cottage is now essentially complete. I'm not too sure about the roof, but I do think something of this sort was preferable to yellow. I placed the cottage on the layout and took pictures, but when I looked at these pictures I realised that the unpainted underside of the roof could be seen round the upper windows and at the ends, resulting in a rather silly effect where the plain grey of the plastic showed. So the cottage had to go back to the bench and I painted under the edges of the roof. Here's the cottage back on the layout next to the Will's cottage that I built previously, with the undersides of the roof edges now painted. I do think I'm happier with the windows assembled this way, as against the way with the whole frame and sill on the outside. It's a pity I couldn't do a better job with painting, but it was quite a challenge, as I say. The black on the beams is clearly wobbly, but perhaps this doesn't look entirely unrealistic. Overall, I'm reasonably happy with the appearance of the cottage, at least as seen from a distance in context.